wanted to acknowledge that the Powerhouse Museum website is the source of many of the images in this presentation. And that is because of my familiarity with the museum and its collections, having been a curator there for many, many years. I'm currently a consultant for transport heritage projects, mainly involved in doing significance assessments of collections, transport collections and transport objects. Broadly speaking, not just in the automotive area, but this presentation focuses on the automotive aspects of the Powerhouse Museum collection. The Powerhouse Museum and its automobile collection, indeed the entire museum, has its origins in this wonderful building, the Sydney International Exhibition of 1879, which sought to present the capacities of one of the colonies of New South Wales, of Australia rather, New South Wales, to showcase industrial manufactures. And sadly, that building was destroyed by fire only 3 years after the exhibition closed. It was a fabulously successful exhibition though, and its collection, the collection that was actually donated, collection of artefacts that was donated for the exhibition, became the basis of the collection of the museum. So it's a wonderful segue into the origins of the collection of what became the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences. It shows you the museum's first home in Harris Street. But firstly, just a little bit of schooling in the word museum. There is a generally accepted definition we can thank the International Council of Museums for, that a museum is a non-profit, permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study and enjoyment. So that's quite a mouthful, but essentially a museum is a collection of artefacts open to the public. The origins of this collection, I've already mentioned something about the international exhibition which led to the Technological, Industrial Museum, formed in 1880. It became the Technological Museum in 1890, which was within what was then called the Department of Public Instruction within the New South Wales colonial government. And as such, its role was very much educational and didactic. So this was cemented with the opening of the building that you see in the current picture as the museum's home from 1893, and it was amalgamated with the Sydney Technical College. So one of the most important audiences that the museum had for much of its early career in this building was to students who were learning their trades in the adjacent Sydney Technical College, in the same grounds basically as the museum. We move on to 1945, when the museum's name was changed to the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences through an act of the New South Wales government, and that still continued the traditional role of the museum to display selected objects, this is a quote from the act, arranged to illustrate the industrial advance of civilization and the development of inventions and manufactures, which of course includes motor cars. Now, that kind of gives you the impression that technology was a march of progress, all in the service of mankind. It's interesting that the wording of the Act from 1945 comes just at the end of a world war that was a conflagration of enormous scale across the world, involving the very things, the quote-unquote progress of technology that was as much evident in warfare as it was in peacetime. It was realised from the 1930s that the capacity of the museum to exist in the old building that you just saw the picture of was fast depleting, and but it still took another 40 or 50 years for the state government to make a decision that the Powerhouse Museum would be the new name of the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, and it would be developed as a bicentennial project through the 1980s until in 1988 the new museum opened, And you can see that photograph there is taken in about 1983 when the old Automotive Powerhouse, which had been disused for some 30 years, was being refurbished as a new home for the museum. And at that point, the future of the museum and its collections seemed assured. The project had a lifetime of 100 years, a century of life, as the new home for the museum. One of the feature objects on display in the museum's transport gallery was the Type 37A Grand Prix Bugatti that won the 1929 Australian Grand Prix on Phillip Island. Very many benefits of a long-term curated collection in a public museum. Public museums and galleries and their collections are usually established by an act of parliament or some instrument of government. We think of public museums as the trustees of the nation's cultural capital. That's one way of expressing it. There's a long-term continuity as a benefit of these collections and museums that build up a collection made possible by the lifespan of the institution, almost always far exceeding the lifespan of, say, a private collector. The long history of a public museum encourages the emergence of collecting traditions by successive curators who regard themselves as custodians, temporary custodians of a collection. This provides dividends, including developing collections with depth and richness and the preservation of original as-used condition. High-quality automotive acquisitions can be attracted into these sorts of collections, and instructional exhibits serve the educational remit of the museum. All public museums adhere to what's called the National Standards for Australian Museums and Galleries, which requires the establishment of sound policies and procedures to protect, develop and interpret museum and gallery collections. In theory, at least, governments have an obligation to preserve a public collection from sale or other forms of disposal or from degradation. They are essentially, though not entirely, protected from being compromised by the economic duress in the state or federal treasury, depending on whether it's a state or a national museum. One of the aspects that I mentioned that public museums particularly can benefit from is their educational remit and purpose, and in providing an insight into the workings of automobiles, the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, or more to the point, the Powerhouse Museum collection, has some wonderful cutaway exhibits that were incorporated in the museum's collection from the late 1920s. This is one example, one of the most interesting ones, and you can see in the not very good quality image on the left, bottom left, that's the 1930 Chrysler 72 section chassis that was on display in the museum in that decade, the 1930s, and in fact until about the 1960s. And you can see some of the cutaway work there in detail over the diff. Here's another example. This is a Morris 8 chassis donated by the Nuffield Australia in 1950. Some of you will know that Lord Nuffield was Richard William Morris, the founder of Morris Motors UK. And on my first day working in the museum in 1980, this was on display in the ground floor of the museum, and it had been there for probably about 30 years. And one of its purposes, of course, was for the students studying at the Sydney Tech who were doing various vehicle trade courses, and they would come in and see exhibits like this. This 1939 Chevrolet Master section sedan was apparently, we have a movie film of it on display in at the opening of the GMH Pagewood plant. And I'd imagine Norm knows a bit about that. Fascinating exhibit. Now, apart from sectioned exhibits, cutaway exhibits, one of the features of a public collection developed over a long period of time and preserved unused is that original condition is maintained for an extraordinarily long period. This 1912 12 horsepower rover was purchased by the museum in 1948, and it's basically been in storage all that time. And you can see from these images, including the image showing the number plate, just how original the condition is. This serves the educational remit of the museum, particularly with regard to having a research collection which provides a reference point for how motor cars actually looked in their as-used in-service state. Here's another example, 1905 Cadillac Model F. And this one was donated by John McGrath Limited in 1934. This is a 1935 Ford V8, which was in the same family from 1935 to 1985. And in that 50 years, every conceivable detail of the history of the vehicle was recorded by the owner, who passed it on to his son, and his son donated it under the tax incentive scheme in 1985. There is an advantage, as I think I mentioned, in the continuity of a collection in a public museum over a long time being curated by a number of custodians in the person of the curators. In recognising trends and opportunities. The acquisition of the Detroit electric car, which is on the right-hand side, dating from 1916, was donated by Arthur Allen, its former owner, in 1947. It offered a perspective to my colleagues and I about the alternative energy automation that encouraged later acquisitions, like the solar resource car, the one on the top left that you can see, which was the private entry winner of the 1987 World Solar Challenge from Darwin to Adelaide, or the Honda Insight on the bottom left, which I understand dates from 2001, was the first hybrid car offered for sale in Australia. Now, the big disadvantage with government policy. Public museums and their collections are vulnerable to changes in government policy. From the late 1980s, the New South Wales state government introduced a policy of efficiency dividends. Now, those of you who've worked in government will know what I'm referring to, but efficiency dividends are a bit of an evil. They're a favourite in state and federal treasury in order to save money over a period of time by accumulating increasing percentages of reductions in real terms in budgets by identifying theoretical savings in the very least. But as they bite, even though there's no nominal loss of service provision by a government entity, as much a public museum as any other government department, unfortunately it ultimately results in a serious depletion of the capacity of each department or agency to perform its functions. Budgets become more constrained, and eventually the situation becomes untenable, as it did at the Powerhouse. In effect, there's a slow grind. I hope you like the illustration, the mortar and pestle. The slow grind gradually results in a number of depletions of resource, and we heard a previous paper about risk management from Nathan. Governments can and do mess with public museums and galleries for nakedly political outcomes. In the case of the Powerhouse, in 2015, the then Premier of New South Wales, Mike Baird, proposed the sale of the Powerhouse Museum site and its relocation to a new site on what turned out to be a flood-prone riverbank 21 kilometres west of Ultimo at Parramatta. This was seen as an electoral winner for the government's Go West campaign, which sought to win voters in Western Sydney. But it wasn't cloaked that way, of course. It was established as a cultural opportunity. But because the museum was particularly vulnerable after years of underfunding, there was already a situation of reputational damage that was an issue that needed to be responded to. I couldn't find an appropriate image there, so I just found a cartoon which shows a politician of the day of 5-6 years ago, trifling with the Powerhouse Museum as if it was a cultural item of worth about the same as a snow cone. These are some of the threats, risks, threats, losses that the museum has had to address over the last 5 years. Because there's been such negative publicity, and there's been a campaign fighting against the decision to relocate the museum. But a year ago, there was a partial victory. The campaign that was fought, including participation by myself, led to a partial backdown where the government agreed to retain the Powerhouse site at Automotive. And then about a month ago, or 2 months ago, they gave $500 million, which is a lot of cash, to redevelop the Ultimo site. But they nominated that it was essentially to be about a fashion and design museum. But it was also, rather confusingly, to draw on the entire collection, which spans science, technology, decorative arts, social history, and industry. So the challenge for the future is to regain what's been lost incrementally over the last 20 years and build it up again over the next 20 years, which includes, and it's been mentioned by other speakers, a loss of collective expertise and corporate knowledge and memory, which in a museum is so critically important, particularly one that has a history going back 140 years. Now, I just thought I'd throw this in because it's a bit of a pot stirrer, particularly the first dot point, but it alludes to something I learnt recently when I was in conversation with some people at Sydney Bus Museum. Scandinavian and European countries and cities, as you would know, have introduced certain bans on the city limits of the use of motor cars, petrol engine motor cars. And climate policy will hasten change. Now, I mention as an example, and maybe for later discussion, the fact that the Transport Museum in Withall, near Birmingham, with whom I was in contact, has recently had to hire a local coach service to transport their visitors from the city centre to the museum because the museum's historic buses that they had been using for this purpose don't comply with Birmingham's clean air zones. And the Birmingham City Council gave them the only option, which was to pay £50 fee per non-compliant bus per day in order to continue to use their historic buses for this purpose. Just thought I'd throw that in because we may, at some stage in the future, be having to plan in risk management terms. And I think, yes, Larry made some reference to a dedicated area where it may be necessary in the future to operate hot rods or, motor cars or whatever, should these kinds of restrictions apply more broadly.
Thank you, Andrew. Fascinating history and some future gazing too that is likely very pertinent over a period of time and probably needs strategic thinking and planning now, as we've noted in a few of the presentations. David McKenzie.
Thanks, Simon. Andrew, I was just wondering, does Powerhouse have active vehicles? Have you faced the same issues in terms of maintaining your collection as the National Museum and maybe others have?
Thanks for asking that question, David. The answer is yes. There's not been much activation lately. Probably the exception would be running them just for the purpose of keeping them activated, but not for public appearances. The biggest issue is that the museum's expertise has been eroded so much that we no longer, when I say we, I mean after 33 years at the place, and even though it's 8 years since I've left there, it's hard not to talk about it as if it was still your own organisation. but the museum no longer has the kind of expertise that it once did to service the needs of an active collection and to actually have people operating these vehicles. It's hard pressed to operate its steam engines. It's operating stationary steam engines at the moment, though it still does. But as far as vehicles being operated are concerned, that will be something to work on. That's a future challenge to retrieve those skills and training, trade training, and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Sounds like a challenge.
Yeah, it is. It will be.
Marcus McInnes.
Good afternoon, Andrew. It's Mark McInnes.
Hello, Mark. It's lovely to talk to you, even remotely.
It's so many years since we've met, and I do understand the situation you find yourself in. It occurs to me to ask the group: are there any other New South Wales people at the conference?
It's actually Marcus, more presenters from New South Wales than ever before. I think we have more New South Wales presenters than Victorian presenters for once, and we have quite a few on the call from New South Wales, yes.
Well, that's excellent. That's excellent. I quite understand the situation in New South Wales. It's, apart from Canberra, it's probably, and Victoria, it's probably the capital of wokeness in a sense that all the concerns are about social science and hard science is diminishing in significance. But I really have enjoyed the presentation to date. Unfortunately, I can't be there all the time. I popped in and out, and unfortunately, I lost the connection and had to reconnect for some reason or other. But I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of the day. And I understand, Andrew, the political situation you find the museum finds itself in. And I don't see that getting solved until COVID's over and dusted in the next 12 months. So,
yeah, I think you're right. If I can make a highly political observation, best briefly, because I realise time is short. It's my understanding from personal experience and from talking to others that, and others may care to comment on this later in the day, that there is a particular philosophical issue that conservative governments often have to museums, particularly public museums, most evidently shown in the Thatcher era in Britain by about 1990, when public museums were on their knees as a result of a philosophy that reflects a conservative view of politics, not being able to understand why public museums can't generate their own money the way they would like and pay their way the way that any other institution or enterprise might. They don't understand, as Labor or socialist governments tend to, and this is, I'm not being political per se, it's just an observation, they don't understand that there is community benefit or public good by the very existence and protection of these organisations.
I certainly would agree with that comment. Everything we touch seems to be contaminated with process management these days, and we've seen some evidence of that this morning. And while that's important, there has to be a careful balance between process management and the reality of the value of these institutions in providing the depth of knowledge that we require to progress forward. Anyway, it's getting a bit philosophical and getting away from the whole thing. And of course, it's also the prerogative of old people to be more reflective and progressive in their look towards the future.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
Some very good points from both of you. So thank you. Alison Wayne, I also note that you have a question.
Hi, yes, I just wanted to say that there was a great seminar a while ago by the Scottish Technology History place, and I've sent you the link, Simon. We don't seem to have a chat session, but if that might be of interest to people. And if you go into that link and then just go into the burning fossil fuels, burning questions, burning something section,
Yes.
you can see the recording. It's really interesting. They've got a really intense discussion.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, it was only because I was running out of time, Alison, that I didn't make reference to it. But it's the interestingly named Scottish Transport and Industry Collections Knowledge Network, known as STIC. And one of their most interesting papers was in the International Committee for the Conservation of Industrial Heritage online newsletter about 2 months ago, in which they have drawn great attention to this issue about the sustainability of running engines based on fossil fuels.
Cool, thank you. I mean, the website for anyone who's taking notes is stickssn.org. That's STICK as in stick, SSN.org. So I've just picked that up from my email so that everyone can note that down. If you do need to reference that again, feel free to email me after the session and I can provide that to you if you haven't been able to note it down.